Hello, we're John and Elizabeth. We're in the shed with Coric. She's nice and dry, and we've been doing two things mostly. We've been getting ready for putting a new layer of antifouling on, and we have also been sizing up, preparing the spray hood. So we'd like to show you how both of those things are going. The other thing we've done is, or rather the team have done, is they've dealt with a defect we didn't really know we had. So I hope that is also of interest.
It's been quite good fun being back in the shed. So we hope you enjoy the video. Thank you very much for watching.
Thank you for watching.
We always knew we were going to need to pull the boat out, so we got the boat along to Hamble Point, as you saw in our previous episode. It's always a slightly nervous moment when you pull the boat out. We knew there was going to be a fair bit of growth underneath. We'd sort of seen that building up, and the surveyor had advised us that we needed to put more antifouling on, but as we'll describe later, James and I had a conversation about that and decided to go sailing instead. As always, as I say, it's a slightly nerve-wracking moment. Boat comes out, but actually underneath everything looked just fine, if slightly dirty. So it was a horrible wet day when we did this, but out she came. Have a little bit of a look right towards the transom, and you'll see where the growth is, and you see where the water line is, and it doesn't quite match up, and that was a comment that had been made, and we'll talk a little bit about what we're going to do about that later. But you can see that we sometimes in our berth sit gently in the mud, and we'd had a few goes at scrubbing growth off, and you can see the little patches of green there where the antifouling got rubbed off and possibly made the whole problem worse. When they got it ashore and started hosing it off with the jet wash, what happened was the antifouling came off really, really quickly. We'd spoken to James about putting the boat into the blast shed in order to get this stuff off, but glad we decided not to do that, because to be honest, it all came off really very straightforwardly indeed. Most of it got off with a jet wash, and then we sat outside for a little while with a bit of sandpaper and some grinders and took it back. This isn't the finished article. This was at the end of about day one. No, just after we spread it out, but we got a lot more of that antifouling off, especially around the rudder, but everything looked pretty good. And then just after Christmas she moved into the shed, almost exactly where she was before. Everything nice and dry, and a nice place to work, as well as prepare for the antifouling going on.
We're in the shed. We're looking at Coric. She's being prepared for being copper coated. Yep. This was we had a conversation ages ago about whether or not we should do this when we were in the run up to launching, and decided against it because we were up against the buffers a bit.
No, well, you wanted to go sailing.
Wanted to go sailing. Yeah. So we delayed that job till now. So this is arguably the missing episode from the summer of last year. But there's a fair bit of preparation that needs to go on.
So we've taken all the antifouling off. So you can't copper coat onto old antifouling, so it has to come back to a GRP or an epoxy substrate. So this made it quite easy, because when we lifted the boat out, because the antifouling had been on the boat in the shed for however long, by the time we lifted the boat out, most of the antifouling had fallen off anyway. So it was quite a no-brainer really. Okay. Right, so to copper coat onto the boat, we can't have any old antifouling on the boat. So the copper coat doesn't like going onto antifouling, so that all had to be stripped off. Because we didn't antifoul the boat when we launched it, and the antifouling had already been sat on the boat for a few years in the shed, when the boat was lifted, most of it had actually pretty much worn off. So that made it a bit of a no-brainer to strip it back and use the opportunity to go for copper coat, which we were discussing before we launched it. So the boat has been gel shielded. So this green and grey paint on the bottom is gel shield 200. So she's already had an osmosis barrier put on her. Where we've sanded off, the areas that you can see are grey, these are areas where, as we sanded through anywhere that was looking thin, we've overcoated and reprimed. So the boat is now in this state ready to be copper coated. You can see the skid fittings are masked off, and they're masked off slightly oversized of the skin fitting. So the edge of the skin fitting is about 1/2 inch inside of the tape. Copper coat is in theory a completely inert coating, so all the copper granules are entirely cocooned within the resin. So theoretically you can apply it onto absolutely anything, and we've had no real problems with it, apart from we have had a couple of issues where the copper coat starts to go funny around the bronze Blake's type skin fittings, which is what Coric has. So whenever we do copper coating around bronze skin fittings now, we mask a 1/2 inch margin around, and then that will be anti-fouled with traditional anti-fouling just around the skin fittings. Okay, we had an issue with a leak, which we'll talk about. So we had water coming out of the back of the stern tube. So we've had a leak from the back end of the boat. The leak actually isn't from the stern tube. The leak was from the top of the rudder tube. However, the cutlass bearing was slightly worn, and there was water holding up behind the bearing carrier, so the stainless fitting that screws into the back here. So in order to get all this off, the rudder had to come out. So whilst the rudder is out, we've taken the opportunity to make sure we prime and copper coat up inside the front of the rudder and in around the back of the skeg.
One of the other things that we knew we didn't know was just exactly how the boat sat in the water, and as you'll have seen from pictures, that she sort of looks as if she's slightly sat down by the stern.
In fact she isn't. The water line was too low at the stern, so the boat's been the topsides have been redone and all the bottom coatings have been done. So I think they may have lost the water line when they did the work originally before it came here.
It just didn't look right, and certainly a number of people commented to me, people who know the boats asked, are you going to move the water line?
And you get fouling up onto the top sides.
It looked properly horrible, and we got a picture of it. So we got the chance to move it up and put it in the right place. So we had a nice conversation about the various options. We could either go copper coat, busting up to the gel coat, and just leave it at that. We could put a topping
white boot top back on. So if you're going to do a white anti-fouling boot top, we would usually take the copper coat up to the water line, and then put the boot top on top of the copper coat. So you've got a copper coat base in effect. But it does mean half of the attraction of having copper coat is there's very little annual maintenance to do. So if you boot top the boat with anti-fouling, you are then back to anti-fouling every year. So the option which we're going to go for is to put a vinyl stripe above the anti-fouling, above the copper coat.
So it'd be copper coat, vinyl stripe on top of the gel coat, and then you'll see the gel coat above it. And we had a look at a few boats in the yard and sort of looked at the various options, and this one's as close as to what she looked like before. Just everything's a bit further up.
A tiny bit higher, and the boats don't look out of place with the stripe slightly above where existing stripe was.
So it should look good. And Monday morning, all being well,
copper coat will be going on.
Copper coat goes on. 5 coats one day.
5 coats one day. All has to be applied. You have to apply with copper coat. You have to apply a coat. It's a cumulative build-up of coats, and you generally in a temperature controlled environment like this, we can generally set the temperature up so you're about half an hour between coats. So you do 5 coats, and you basically have to wait until the tack point is right. Otherwise, when you roll the next coat on, it rolls the old coat off if you get it too early.
Which you don't want to do.
Which you don't want to do.
The whole idea of this is do it once, do it right.
Exactly. And we'll get a nice finish. So you should have a nice smooth finish. And very hard, long wearing.
Fingers crossed. Well, more than fingers.
More than fingers. No, it'll work. Of course it'll work.
It'll be fine.
One of the other big jobs that we were doing was getting ready for the spray hood. So we measured up for the hoops about the middle of the season, once we knew exactly where the boom was going to be when we were sheeted in with various reefs in. So we knew the exact clearance that we had. Then we set this all up in order to get the anchoring points right. And Elizabeth and I both stood in the cockpit and made sure that we could see underneath those forward and had the right angle of view. Once we'd got that all sorted, Lorraine from Loskit came down and she covered the frame with a templating material, and we talked about exactly where things would be. So for example, we wanted to have some pockets inside, but the big thing was making sure that the hoops were in the right place and that the windows were going to be in the right place such that we could see out. We also wanted to talk about how it would work on a day-to-day basis, and chatting to Lorraine, really interesting. Doing this, you do this differently for different boats depending on how they're going to be used. So what you do for a charter boat isn't what you do for a boat with a family, isn't what you do for a boat that's going to go racing. So we talked about how the boat was going to be used and how we're going to use the spray hood, and how we would operate it, how it gets put away, whether or not we were going to need to move the boom. So sighting the boom carefully was an important part of all of this. We also talked about the various fasteners and obviously different types. I'd seen a lot of old fasteners that, look really tatty really quickly. So we're going to go for these ones over here that should work very nicely. And then we practiced putting it up, putting it down, making sure that the windows were going to be in exactly the right place. So all of that was really very helpful indeed, and that all happened a week or so ago, and then Lorraine came back. So having got the template sorted out, she then cut the pieces out and stitched them together lightly in order to see how they exactly fitted on. And we also had the conversation about, you can see the clear bit of templating fabric there. We're basically going to put a back panel onto the spray hood such that we can have the spray hood up and close that back panel off in order to have the hatch open even if there is driving rain from behind us. So how to go at fitting all of that, and obviously you don't want to fit that until actually you've got the main part of the spray hood in place. So that was all very helpful and useful, and she will bring that back next week, and we should have the whole thing fitted shortly.
I mentioned that when we came in, we had one job that we've done that we weren't expecting to do, but we knew there was a problem because we'd had a bit of a build-up of water inside the boat and really didn't know where it was coming from. Different amounts. I saw a tiny little line from the stern tube, and I thought it must be that.
Yeah, so you had a witness mark of water running from around the stern tube area. So the immediate worry was that the stern tube was leaking. Not an impossible thing to fix, but a bit more expensive than you would really like. In the end, we tracked the leak back further. It was coming from the aft side of the bulkhead, and it was actually tracking out, and it was coming through the top of the rudder tube, where the rudder tube is sealed to the deck. The way the rudder tube is fitted into the boat is it is a stainless tube with a top flange welded to it, and it's slid in through the top from a cockpit when they put the hull and deck together. It's fitted to the deck with a timber wedge, which is here, which is just a piece of teak cut to a wedge with a hole in the middle, and it's bolted to the deck, and then it's glassed into the bottom of the boat. So you can't take it out very easily. So in order to fix the leak, you have to either cut the tube out, which would involve machining. We usually make up like an extended hole saw, and we machine over the top of it, and then we take the whole tube out. But the trouble is, to put it back again, you've then got to get in there and glass it up, and the access is not very good. So what we've decided to do is we split the timber wedge out from under the top of the flange. There was almost no bedding left, so the bedding was probably original, so it's probably just dry. Yep. She's been inside a long time, so it's probably just dried out and the bedding's just failed. Now, in order to put a packer back underneath, we've made up a split packer from GRP, which we're going to paint, and we will bond it and slide the two halves into the top of the fitting and then rebolt it, and that will fix it.
Yeah. Yeah, so that bit of teak comes out. There's been a repair in at the top.
Yeah.
There will be a new piece that goes in GRP.
In GRP in two parts.
Yeah,
so
two
it will be
parts.
port starboard and it will slide together.
And then
and it will be bonded and flexed in as we slide it and clamp it, and then it will be bolted back to the deck.
Yeah.
And
it was one of those leaks. Sometimes it was next to nothing. Sometimes it was quite a lot. It wasn't seawater. It was rainwater.
Yeah, it wasn't really work, but also it can complicate matters a little bit when if you have a heavy day at sea.
Yes, the
And
cockpit's
it's not
full.
raining, and you have salt water in the cockpit. Then all of a sudden your leak turns into a saltwater leak. So it can be quite hard to trace.
It was confusing at the time, but when James and the team started looking at it, it became immediately obvious what it was, and thankfully it wasn't the stern tube.
Yeah. No, stern tubes can leak, but it's rare because they're bonded in over such a long length. For the whole lot to fail is rare.
Yeah, and this was really just a failure at the point where the top of the rudder tube met the bottom of the cockpit deck and the bedding in there.
Yes, exactly that. Yeah.
Better to have fixed it now. Better to have fixed it in the dry.
Exactly. Yeah. Nice dry trip around the UK next year.
Yeah, absolutely. Trust that was interesting and you enjoyed it. We will do an update on the copper coat going on. We'll show you the final fit of the spray hood in an episode to come shortly.
Yes, I've very much enjoyed coming down today, and thank you very much for watching.
Thank you for watching. Bye-bye.